She spent years deciding who belonged until one wrong assumption cost her everything. Clarissa Vaugh, a first-class flight attendant, questioned a passenger, then questioned him again, but when she made him prove himself, she had no idea he was Brigadier General Edric Holt, a war hero and husband of the airline's owner. By the time the plane landed, the tables had turned. Security waited for her, the captain called her in, and Eleanor Holt, the woman with the power to end her career, was ready to decide her fate. What happens when the enforcer becomes the judge? Where are you watching from? Comment below, hit like and subscribe, and let's get into it. The airport hummed with its usual rhythm, a steady pulse of rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, and the crisp voice of a flight attendant calling for final boarding. Edric Holt moved through it all with a quiet certainty. His steps slow but deliberate. His posture upright, shoulders squared in a way that spoke of discipline ingrained over decades. He was a man who had spent his life in motion, from airbases to battlefields to boardrooms. And yet, here, in the first-class section of an airport, it was as if he had stepped into a place that did not expect him. At gate 14, a young woman with a practiced airline smile scanned his boarding pass. "You're all set, Mr. Holt," she said, her voice warm, professional. She had no reason to doubt him. No reason to pause. No reason to wonder if he belonged. Clarissa Vaugh did. She was watching before she even realized it. A man, alone, moving with the kind of unhurried confidence that should have reassured her but did the opposite. He was older, with neatly cropped silver hair. His suit crisp but understated. A single military pin fastened to his lapel. She noted the details, how he carried himself, how he barely glanced at the signs, as if he already knew where he was going. And then, like a stone skipping across water, her mind leapt to the one thing she could not shake. Something about him felt off. She had worked this route for years. She knew first-class passengers. She knew the way they carried themselves, the way they expected service, the way they exuded money in ways both subtle and garish. And she knew when something didn't fit. As Edric moved down the jet bridge, the uneasy feeling in her stomach grew. It wasn't that she had a reason, real suspicion. The kind based on protocol. The kind that could be justified in a report. It was something else. Something instinctual. By the time he reached his seat 1A, first class, a window seat that offered the perfect view of a world he had spent his life navigating, Clarissa had already decided to act. She stepped toward him with the certainty of someone who believed she was doing her job, not realizing the weight of the moment she was creating. "Sir," she said, her voice smooth, polite but firm, "I think you might be in the wrong section." The words hovered between them. A moment stretched so thin it felt fragile. Edric turned, slowly, deliberately, as if he had heard this before, as if he had seen this exact moment play out in 1,000 different ways, under different names, in different places. His expression was unreadable, his brown eyes steady as he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For a second, Clarissa imagined he was reaching for something else, a badge, an explanation, proof of something unspoken but necessary. But it was just his boarding pass. Simple, direct, undeniable. She took it, scanned it quickly, her eyes flicking across the details. Seat 1A, first class, his name, everything was correct. For the briefest moment, a flicker of doubt passed through her. But rather than acknowledge it, she masked it, handed the ticket back, forced a smile. "I just wanted to double-check," she said, her voice light, almost pleasant. "Mistakes happen." It was the kind of line that should have erased the moment, smoothed it over like a stone in a river. But some things don't wash away. Edric said nothing. He took the ticket back, slipped it into his jacket, and settled into his seat. Across the aisle, a businessman looked up from his laptop, glancing at them before returning to his screen. A woman in designer sunglasses flipped a page in her magazine, pretending not to hear. The air in the cabin shifted, an invisible tension settling into the space between them. Clarissa turned on her heel and walked away. But something about the way Edric had looked at her lingered. Not angry, not defensive, just patient. She had seen that look before. In history books, in old photographs, in the eyes of men who had lived through things she would never fully understand. And yet, she still didn't let it go. As the last of the first-class passengers settled in and the overhead compartments clicked shut, Clarissa stood near the galley, arms crossed. Something wasn't sitting right. She wasn't used to being questioned, not by passengers, not by her own instincts. She turned to Mara Patel, one of the junior attendants. Her voice low. Did you check the first-class manifest? Mara blinked, startled. Yes. The passenger lists are always checked before boarding. Check it again, Clarissa insisted, her voice leaving no room for argument. Mara hesitated. You think his ticket isn't real? Clarissa's jaw tightened. I think he's in the wrong seat. Mara glanced toward Edric, then back at Clarissa. He scanned in at the gate with no issue. If there was a problem, they would have flagged it. Clarissa exhaled sharply. Just check. Mara nodded reluctantly and walked toward the cockpit. Clarissa straightened her uniform, her mind racing. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was just a mistaken assumption misplaced. A gut feeling that didn't hold weight. But maybe, just maybe, she was right. And that was enough to make her watch him. Edric sat as he had before, silent, composed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't reading a newspaper. He simply sat, his eyes focused ahead, as if he were already miles away. Clarissa hated it. She moved back into the aisle, stopping beside his seat again. Sir, she said, her voice still polite, but clipped now. I need to see your ticket again. Edric turned his head, meeting her gaze. He didn't look startled. He didn't look confused. He looked like he had been expecting this. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the boarding pass once more, and held it out with the same steady hand. Clarissa took it, scanning the details carefully. Seat 1A, first class. Everything was in order. And yet, the irritation inside her only grew. She forced another tight smile, handed the ticket back. Thank you, just making sure. Without another word, she turned and walked away. But something inside her told her this was far from over. The plane hummed with the low, steady vibration of the engines, a familiar rhythm that should have signaled routine. Passengers settled into their seats, flipping through glossy in-flight magazines, adjusting their pillows, or scrolling through their phones. It was a world of small, ordinary moments, a bubble of silence before takeoff. But beneath that quiet, something else was brewing, a tension that pulsed just beneath the surface. Unspoken but undeniable. Clarissa Vaugh felt it like a storm on the horizon, something she couldn't yet see but knew was coming. She stood near the galley, her fingers gripping the counter, eyes flicking toward the first-class cabin where Edric Holt sat, still as a mountain. He had done nothing wrong. Not one misstep, not one misplaced movement. And yet, she couldn't let it go. She watched him the way a seasoned gambler watches a deck of cards being shuffled, waiting for the tell. The misstep that would justify what her instincts told her. He was too calm, too steady. People questioned in first class usually stammered, fumbled for words, reacted with a flash of irritation or confusion. Not him. His stillness unsettled her. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't fear, it was something else entirely. Maybe that's why she did what she did next. She turned to the junior flight attendant, Mara Patel, and without lowering her voice, she said, I need to inspect his bag. Mara froze, her hands tightening on the tray she had been arranging. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. But Clarissa gave her no room to argue. The captain approved it, Clarissa added, knowing that authority, once invoked, left little room for hesitation. Mara swallowed, nodded stiffly, and moved toward the cockpit to retrieve flight records. Meanwhile, Clarissa stepped forward, her polished heels clicking softly against the aisle carpet. The cabin's energy shifted. The kind of quiet that comes when people sense something happening but pretend not to notice. Edric didn't move. He didn't even turn his head when she stopped beside him. Sir, she said, voice smooth, professional, but now carrying an edge of finality. I need to inspect your bag. Slowly, deliberately, Edric turned his head, meeting her gaze. There was no anger in his expression, no sign of protest. He exhaled once, a deep, measured breath, and then, in a voice that carried the weight of something she could not name, he asked, Do you have a warrant for that? The words landed like a sharp knock on a closed door. Across the cabin, pages of a magazine stopped mid-turn. A businessman who had been half listening to a podcast took out one earbud. A woman adjusting her silk scarf paused just slightly, the movement betraying her attention. Clarissa forced a small chuckle, tilting her head slightly. Sir, this is an airline security procedure. We are allowed to inspect passenger belongings if we believe there's a concern. Edric didn't blink, And what concern would that be? The question hung between them like an unclaimed debt. Clarissa knew how to handle confrontations, knew how to wield the tone of authority like a blade that cut through doubt. But something about this man, his stillness, the way he simply waited, unnerved her. She reached up, unlatched the overhead bin, and pulled down the worn leather bag. A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers pretended not to watch, but their silence was an audience all the same. She placed the bag on his empty seat, her fingers brushing against the aged leather. It was not the kind of bag first-class passengers usually carried. Not the sleek, designer duffels or the monogrammed briefcases. This was something older, something carried for function rather than status. The kind of bag that had been places. She hesitated only for a fraction of a second, then pulled at the zipper. Inside, neatly folded clothes, a leather-bound notebook, a newspaper, carefully folded to the editorial section. A book, Leadership Under Fire. The Psychology of Decision-Making in War. Nothing out of place. Nothing that justified the feeling in her gut. Her fingers curled slightly, gripping the edge of the bag. This didn't make sense. She had been so sure. Edric let the silence stretch between them before speaking again. His voice even, unshaken. Find what you were looking for. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't mockery. It was worse than that. It was patience. Clarissa straightened, her mind working quickly to regain control of the moment. Just following security measures, she said briskly. Zipping the bag shut, she lifted it and handed it back to him. He took it without a word, placing it back in the overhead bin with the same slow, deliberate ease that made her skin prickle. But this time, when he settled back into his seat, there was something different in the way he leaned back. Something that made it clear he had just let her walk into her own mistake. Clarissa turned abruptly and walked toward the galley, ignoring the way her face burned. Mara was still standing near the service station, her tray long forgotten. You searched his bag, Mara whispered, her voice a careful thread of disbelief. Clarissa exhaled sharply. It was necessary. Mara's expression didn't change. You didn't find anything. Clarissa clenched her jaw. I don't make mistakes. Mara didn't argue. She didn't have to. The way the passengers were looking at Clarissa now, the quiet, lingering glances, the shift in energy said enough. She wasn't sure which was worse, the whispers, or the silence. And Edric, he didn't have to say a word. He had already won. The plane cut through the sky. Steady, precise, its engines humming with the kind of controlled power that made flight seem effortless. Inside the cabin, the illusion of order remained intact. Polished surfaces, neatly folded blankets, the gentle clink of glasses as the attendants moved through the aisles. But beneath that veneer, something had shifted. A current, invisible but undeniable, had spread through first class. The kind of shift that people pretend not to notice but feel in their bones. Clarissa Vaugh felt it most of all. She stood near the galley, hands gripping the edge of the service counter, her pulse still not quite settled. The bag had been empty. No stolen ticket, no contraband, nothing to justify the gnawing certainty she had carried with her since boarding. She had made a choice, and the weight of it now sat on her shoulders like a stone. Across the aisle, passengers had begun to move past their initial shock, resuming their distractions, their quiet conversations, but every now and then, eyes flicked toward her quick, assessing. She was no longer the quiet authority moving seamlessly through the cabin. She had become the spectacle. And then there was him. Edric Holt had not spoken a word since the bag search. He had taken his seat with the same deliberate grace, adjusted his suit jacket, and turned his gaze toward the window, as if the clouds held more interest than the woman who had just publicly questioned his presence. He had not made a scene. He had not demanded an apology. He had done the one thing Clarissa could not have prepared for. He had simply let her be wrong. The absence of retaliation made it worse. A confrontation she could have handled. A raised voice. An argument. Anything that could justify her actions. Instead, she had been left alone with nothing but the echo of her own assumptions. Mara Patel stood a few feet away, her arms folded across her chest, not looking at Clarissa but not avoiding her either. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, a needle sliding into fabric. You still don't get it, do you? Clarissa turned, the tension in her chest sharp as a blade. Excuse me? Mara didn't sigh, didn't raise her voice, just tilted her head slightly as she studied Clarissa the way one might study a cracked mirror. trying to understand what had broken. You didn't find anything, she said simply. And yet, you still feel like you did the right thing. Clarissa stiffened. I was following protocol. Mara let out a small breath. Almost a laugh, but not one filled with amusement. Protocol? She nodded toward Edric's seat. Or instinct? Clarissa opened her mouth to respond. But no words came. Because what could she say? That it had been a feeling? A hunch? That something about the way he had carried himself had seemed off? That she had spent enough time around first-class passengers to know when someone didn't quite fit the mold. What mold was that, exactly? The question unsettled her. She turned back toward the aisle, composing herself, trying to shake the feeling that she was losing control of something she had spent years mastering. This wasn't her. She had always been precise, professional. She had spent her career knowing when to assert herself, when to demand order. And yet, this moment had unraveled that certainty like thread pulled too tightly. Behind her, the cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out. Captain Harrington was not a man prone to unnecessary movement. He was steady, predictable, the kind of man who believed every action should serve a purpose. He rarely left the cockpit mid-flight. But here he was, walking toward her, his expression unreadable. Clarissa felt the shift before he even reached her. The quiet pause in the air. The way passengers subtly turned their heads without seeming to. She straightened. Captain? He didn't acknowledge her immediately. Instead, his gaze moved to Edric Holt, who had turned slightly, meeting the captain's eyes with the same calm patience that had unnerved her before. There was a flicker of recognition, something unspoken exchanged between the two men. Then, Captain Harrington turned back to her. Miss Vaugh, I need a word. Now. The words weren't harsh, they weren't loud, but they carried weight, the kind that pressed down on bone. Clarissa followed him toward the galley, where the noise of the cabin faded just enough to give them privacy. She squared her shoulders. Sir, if this is about the bag search. It is, he interrupted, voice even, and I'd like to know exactly what you were hoping to find. She opened her mouth, but the answer she had rehearsed, the one about protocol, about security concerns, felt flimsy, thin, weak under the scrutiny of his gaze. Harrington didn't wait for her to answer. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple briefly before fixing her with a look that made her stomach turn. Miss Vaugh, do you know who Edric Holt is? Clarissa hesitated. She knew the name now, of course. Had seen it on the manifest. But it meant nothing to her. He's a first-class passenger, she said, carefully neutral. The captain let out a slow breath, almost as if he were gathering patience. Edric Holt, he said, is a retired brigadier general. He flew combat missions before you were born. He has more flight hours in military aircraft than you will ever log in commercial airlines. He has spent his life in the air, defending the very freedoms that allow you to work this job. And you. He paused just enough to let the words settle. Just humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of people. Clarissa's stomach dropped. She had expected pushback. She had expected maybe even a reprimand. But this was something else. He didn't report you, the captain continued, voice measured. He didn't demand an apology. But someone else did, and that complaint has already made its way to the executive office. Clarissa felt her breath tighten. Passengers were watching now, sensing the unraveling of something that had, moments ago, seemed so certain. The whisper of movement, of quiet conversations, of shifting eyes. The invisible but undeniable weight of collective judgment. The captain lowered his voice. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've just created for yourself? Clarissa swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold his gaze. But for the first time, she had no answer. Because the truth was, she hadn't seen him for who he was. She had seen him for who she thought he was. And that, she now realized, had made all the difference. The plane soared steady through the sky. But for Clarissa Vaugh, the ground beneath her feet had already fallen away. The captain's words rang in her head. Clear, final, inescapable. Edric Holt is a retired brigadier general. He flew combat missions before you were born. He has more flight hours in military aircraft than you will ever log in commercial airlines. The weight of those words pressed down on her. Heavier than turbulence. Heavier than the silent judgment that now filled the cabin. She had made a mistake. A serious one. But admitting it felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff with no parachute. The human mind is a stubborn thing. trained to protect itself at all costs, to rewrite the story in ways that make the wounds less deep, the guilt less unbearable. Clarissa's mind was already grasping at excuses. It wasn't personal. It was just protocol. I was doing my job. But something inside her, something small, insistent, was telling her the truth she didn't want to face. She had looked at Edric Holt and made a decision about him before he ever opened his mouth. And now, the whole plane knew it. Clarissa felt the weight of the cabin's silence. The way people weren't quite looking at her, but weren't not looking either. That kind of silence, the kind where people pretend to be absorbed in their books or drinks but are really listening. Watching was worse than outright confrontation. It meant that the judgment had already been passed. She needed to move, do something, anything. She turned on her heel, her polished shoes clicking against the aisle carpet as she walked swiftly back toward the galley, away from the burning weight of Edric's presence. But the moment she reached the quiet of the service area, she was met with the one person she didn't want to see. Mara Patel. The junior flight attendant had been watching everything unfold. And unlike the passengers, she wasn't pretending otherwise. She stood with her arms crossed, her dark eyes steady, waiting, and in that look calm but knowing Clarissa saw something dangerous. Not anger, not superiority, but recognition. You still don't get it, do you? Mara said, her voice quieter than before, but somehow heavier. Clarissa exhaled sharply. Mara, I don't have time for what? Mara cut in, raising an eyebrow. For someone to tell you the truth? Clarissa stiffened, her fingers tightening against the edge of the counter. I was following protocol. Mara let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking her head. You know, you keep saying that, but let's be honest, if that man had looked different, dressed different, if he had the right kind of arrogance, the right kind of entitlement, would you have asked him twice for his ticket? Clarissa opened her mouth, but no words came. Because the real answer was one she didn't want to say out loud. Mara didn't wait for her to respond. And now what? You're gonna walk away from this and tell yourself you were just doing your job? That it wasn't about what you thought when you looked at him? She took a step forward, her voice steady but pointed. Because here's the thing, Clarissa, people like you never think you're wrong. You convince yourself you were just being careful, that you were looking out for safety, that someone else would have thought the same thing. And then, you move on. And the people like him? She jerked her chin toward Edric's seat. They carry that moment forever. Clarissa's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure how. A crackling overhead interrupted them. Captain Harrington's voice calm but firm. Miss Vaugh, please report to the cockpit immediately. Mara didn't say anything else. She just stepped aside, giving Clarissa space to move past her. And for the first time in years, Clarissa felt like she was the one being assessed. She straightened her uniform, lifted her chin, and walked toward the cockpit with all the confidence she could muster. It wasn't enough. Inside, the air felt heavier, the dim lighting making the walls feel closer than they were. Captain Harrington was already seated, his posture stiff, his fingers tapping once against the armrest before he spoke. Miss Vaugh, he said, his voice clipped but controlled. Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in? Clarissa had been expecting a reprimand, but the way he said it, the sheer weight behind it, made her stomach tighten. Sir, he held up a hand. Don't, just listen. She swallowed hard and nodded. The captain leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. That man Edric Holt was a war pilot, a decorated brigadier general, the kind of man whose name is written in military textbooks. And you just humiliated him on a flight he paid for, in a seat he earned the right to sit in. And worse, you did it in front of a plane full of people who recognized exactly what you were doing. Clarissa clenched her hands into fists at her sides, her nails pressing into her palm. I didn't mean what? The captain's voice sharpened. Didn't mean to assume he didn't belong? Didn't mean to ignore the manifest? Didn't mean to let your own bias cloud your judgment? The words sliced through her, raw and unfiltered. The captain exhaled, shaking his head. Do you even know what's about to happen? Do you know who his wife is? Clarissa frowned, thrown off by the shift in conversation. His wife? Captain Harrington gave a dry, humorless chuckle. Eleanor Holt. You might recognize the name. She owns this airline. The world tilted beneath Clarissa's feet. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She called the executive office 15 minutes ago. The captain continued. Filed a complaint personally. When we land, you're going to be met by security and escorted straight to a disciplinary hearing. And if I were you, I'd start thinking about what you're going to say to her." Clarissa's throat went dry. Eleanor Holt, the woman whose signature was on every paycheck, every policy, every rule she had ever enforced. The woman who had built an empire. The woman whose husband she had just publicly humiliated. The air in the cockpit suddenly felt too thin. The captain leaned back in his seat, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time, his voice softened not with kindness, but with something closer to disappointment. "I've been flying for 20 years. Miss Vaugh," he said, "and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: when you make a mistake, own it, because the worst thing you can do right now is walk into that room pretending this was just a misunderstanding." Clarissa's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had spent her entire career making sure she was in control. She had spent years deciding who got treated with respect and who didn't. And now, in a few short hours, she was going to walk into a room where she had no power at all. For the first time, she understood exactly how Edric Holt had felt when she stood over him with suspicion in her eyes. And the worst part? She knew without a doubt that he had handled it better than she ever could. The plane descended, cutting through layers of cloud as the city below sharpened into focus. The wheels hadn't even touched the runway yet, but for Clarissa Vaugh, the freefall had already begun. Her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed sense of authority, all of it hung in suspension. Waiting for impact, she adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, smoothing fabric that no longer carried the same certainty it once did. The intercom dinged, the captain's voice calm as he instructed the cabin crew to prepare for landing. But Clarissa barely heard it. She could only think of what was waiting for her beyond the jet bridge. Outside the window, the airport sprawled like a well-oiled machine. Gates lined with steel birds ready for their next journey. People moving with the purpose of lives in motion. But Clarissa's life had just hit turbulence, and she wasn't sure she'd be cleared for another takeoff. The security officers were already stationed at the arrival gate, 2 men in dark suits standing with the quiet authority that made it clear they weren't there for passenger assistance. They were waiting for her. She forced herself to keep her breathing even, her spine straight, but inside, something cold and uncertain twisted in her chest. The cabin shifted with the ritual of landing. Seat belts clicked open prematurely. Passengers stretched, reached for overhead compartments, but unlike every other flight she had worked, no one rushed to flag her down. No one asked for assistance. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Jonas Clay, the businessman who had observed everything with detached curiosity, shut his laptop slowly, eyes flicking toward her with something that might have been pity. Lena Whitmore, the woman in the designer dress, didn't even bother to pretend she wasn't paying attention. The air was heavy with something unspoken. Edric Holt, however, had not moved. He remained seated, fingers resting lightly on the armrests, his breathing steady, his gaze unfocused as if he were already miles away from this moment. Clarissa wondered what it was like to be him, to have spent a lifetime being underestimated and still emerge unshaken. He had given her nothing, not anger, not argument, not even the satisfaction of confrontation. He had simply let her be wrong and allowed the weight of her own actions to settle on her shoulders. She should say something, anything. But what do you say to a man who had already taught you a lesson without lifting a finger? Before she could decide, the flight doors opened. The security officers stepped in, their presence sharp and unmistakable against the neutral tones of the first-class cabin. One of them, a tall man with neatly pressed lapels, gave her a brief nod. "Miss Vaugh, you'll need to come with us." The finality of it hit her like a sealed verdict. Passengers parted as she moved toward the exit, their silence louder than any reprimand. No one met her eyes. No one had to. Her authority, her position, the quiet power she had once carried in her polished shoes and pressed uniform, it was all gone now. And the worst part? It hadn't been taken from her. She had handed it away the moment she let her assumptions dictate her actions. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool airport air hitting her skin like a slap, she realized something. She had always been the one setting the rules, deciding who belonged and who didn't. But now, for the first time, she was the one being escorted out. She had spent years making snap judgments, moving through the world with the certainty that she knew best. But certainty is a fragile thing when placed under the right light. And now, She was being asked the question she had never thought to ask herself: what if I was wrong? The security team led her down the terminal, past busy travelers who had no idea that one woman's life was quietly unraveling between the polished tiles. But in her periphery, she caught a glimpse of something that made her breath catch. Edric Holt. He was walking just a few paces behind, his leather bags slung over his shoulder. His expression as composed as ever. He had made no effort to interfere. No sign of satisfaction at her downfall. No smirk of victory. Just the same quiet presence he had carried since the moment he boarded. He could have ignored her completely. He had every right to. But as they reached the end of the terminal, where their paths would diverge, one man leaving the airport freely, one woman facing the consequences of her actions, he did something that shook her more than any reprimand from the captain. More than any disciplinary hearing could. He paused. And then, he turned his head, just slightly, just enough that their eyes met for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of anger. It wasn't a look of pity. It was the look of a man who had already known, long before she ever did, that this moment was inevitable. And then, he was gone. Clarissa stood there, rooted to the spot, the echoes of her own footsteps swallowed by the sound of a world moving on. The realization hit her with the weight of something irreversible. This wasn't about Edric Holt. It had never been about him. This was about her. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know where to go next. Clarissa Vaugh had always walked with confidence. She had learned early that control wasn't something you asked for, it was something you commanded. From the polished shoes to the crisp uniform, from the clipped authority in her voice to the way she made people listen. She had built her life around being the one who decided how things worked. But today, for the first time, she was not the one in control. Today, she was the one being called in. The executive lounge was silent in the way expensive places often are, not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that came from power. The kind that let people know that their time here was not their own. Clarissa sat on the edge of the leather chair, back straight, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Across from her, two men in dark suits, corporate types. The kind who rarely looked up from their reports unless something really needed fixing, reviewed a folder that, she knew, held the details of her actions. The doors to the office ahead remained closed. A name etched into the frosted glass. Eleanor Holt. She had never met the woman, but she knew her. Everyone in the airline industry did. She wasn't just an executive, she was the executive. The type of woman who built things from the ground up. Who didn't inherit power but created it. Who had turned a struggling airline into a giant. And now, Clarissa was about to face her. Not as an employee, but as a problem. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. No introduction. No secretary announcing her arrival. Just presence. Eleanor Holt was in her 60s. A woman of refined but effortless power. She didn't wear status in logos or jewels, she was the status. Her tailored navy slacks, the crisp white blouse, the single watch on her wrist, it was the kind of quiet wealth that spoke louder than any brand. But it was her eyes that stopped Clarissa cold. They were sharp, assessing, and completely unreadable. She gestured to the room behind her. Miss Vaugh. Clarissa rose on stiff legs and followed her inside. The office was not ostentatious, but it felt bigger than it was. A room where decisions weren't made, they were finalized. Eleanor took her seat behind a desk that had nothing on it but a tablet and a single sheet of paper. She didn't motion for Clarissa to sit, but after a moment, Clarissa did anyway. Eleanor folded her hands, studying her with the kind of quiet that made Clarissa's skin prickle. Then, finally, she spoke. I won't waste your time asking if you know why you're here. I assume you do. Clarissa swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Good, Eleanor said, leaning back slightly. Because I've already spoken to the captain, reviewed the complaint, and watched the security footage. Clarissa's pulse jumped. Footage. She had known, of course, that airports had cameras everywhere. But hearing it aloud made it feel different. This wasn't a version of the story she could control. This was what had happened. Eleanor tilted her head. Tell me, Miss Vaugh, when you looked at my husband and decided he needed to prove he belonged, what exactly did you see? It wasn't the question she expected. Clarissa had prepared for disciplinary talk, policy reviews, maybe even termination papers. But this was personal. She hesitated. Take your time, Eleanor said. I want to hear your answer. Clarissa exhaled, feeling the room shrink around her. How did she answer that? Did she say it was instinct? That she had been trained to spot things that seemed out of place? That something about Edric Holt had made her pause? Because if she said that, Eleanor would ask why, and Clarissa didn't have an answer that didn't damn her. I made a mistake, she said finally. It was the safest thing she could say. Eleanor nodded, but there was no satisfaction in her face. Yes, you did. The silence stretched. Clarissa expected more a lecture, a breakdown of her errors. But Eleanor just sat there, waiting, watching, and in that silence, something began to press against Clarissa's ribs. A weight she had ignored before but couldn't now. Because the real truth was that she hadn't just made a mistake. She had made a decision. Before she checked his ticket. Before she double-checked the manifest. Before she searched his bag, she had already decided something was wrong. That was the part she hadn't been ready to say. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Here's what's going to happen. Miss Vaugh, I'm not firing you. Not today. Clarissa blinked. You're not? No. Eleanor's voice was steady. Because firing you would be easy. Too easy. And I have no interest in teaching you a lesson you can run from. Clarissa's hands tightened in her lap. Then, what happens next? Eleanor slid the single sheet of paper toward her. Effective immediately. You are being reassigned. You will no longer be a first-class flight attendant. You will be working the boarding gates. Assisting passengers. Clarissa stared at the paper. Gate duty. The place where passengers argued over seating. Where frustrations boiled over. Where she would be dealing with people like herself, the ones who questioned. Who assumed. Who decided things before knowing them? Eleanor's voice cut through her thoughts. You spent years deciding who deserved what kind of service. Now, you're going to see what it feels like when the roles are reversed. Clarissa swallowed hard. For how long? Eleanor's lips curved slightly. It wasn't a smile. It was something colder. As long as it takes. Clarissa knew what that meant. There was no set period. No probation to serve. She would stay there until Eleanor decided she had learned something. If she ever decided. For the first time in years. Clarissa Vaugh had no control. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Tell me something, Miss Vaugh. Do you think you deserve this job? Clarissa's throat went dry. For so long, the answer had been obvious. She had earned her place. She had commanded it. But now? She wasn't so sure. Eleanor nodded, as if she already knew what Clarissa couldn't say. Then, without another word, she picked up her tablet and turned her attention to the screen. Dismissing her without ever saying it. Clarissa rose, her hands cold, the paper feeling heavier than it should. She walked out of the office. Past the men in suits. Past the silence that followed her like a shadow. And as she stepped back into the airport. Back into a world that looked the same but no longer felt familiar. She finally understood the truth. She had spent her whole career controlling how people were treated. Now, she was about to learn what it felt like to have no control at all. Clarissa Vaugh had always walked through airports with a purpose. Her uniform had been more than just fabric, it had been a symbol. A badge of authority. A way of moving through the world with control. Now, stripped of her position in first class, she stood behind the boarding gate counter. Her once polished certainty reduced to a name tag and a stiff smile. The weight of the demotion sat in her stomach like a stone. Heavier than any carry-on she had ever checked. She had always been the one enforcing the rules. Now, she was the one receiving the brunt of them. Passengers swarmed the gate in clusters. Their faces creased with impatience. A man in a suit snapped his fingers to get her attention. A woman with a stroller sighed loudly as she juggled a crying toddler. Someone else waved their boarding pass in her face as if she couldn't see them. She had watched these scenes play out from a distance before. Had even judged the gate agents for not handling it faster. Smoother. Better. But now, standing on the other side, she understood this wasn't about efficiency or skill. This was about something deeper. It was about how people saw you when they thought you weren't worth their patience. A younger agent, Jamie, leaned over with a knowing smirk. Rough morning? Clarissa didn't answer, just pressed her lips into a thin line. Jamie was young, probably in her early 20s, with the casual ease of someone who hadn't yet been crushed by the weight of expectation. She had no idea who Clarissa had been before this. No idea that just days ago, Clarissa had walked these terminals like she owned them. Now, she was just another uniform behind the counter. She turned to the next passenger. An older woman with a sharp gaze and a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. I paid for an aisle seat. But this ticket says I'm in the middle. Fix it. Clarissa pulled up the reservation. The woman had booked a basic economy seat, no upgrades. No aisle preference. The kind of mistake people made all the time. The kind that wasn't really a mistake at all but an assumption that paying something meant you deserved more. I'm sorry, ma'am, but your seat assignment is correct. The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. That's unacceptable. I don't do middle seats. Do you understand? Move someone else. Clarissa felt something sharp and bitter rise in her chest. How many times had she spoken with this exact tone? How many times had she dismissed people the way this woman was dismissing her now? She took a slow breath, swallowing the instinct to push back, to remind this passenger that her ticket was her responsibility, not Clarissa's problem. Instead, she forced the same empty, rehearsed smile she had once hated seeing from others. I'm afraid the flight is full. Ma'am, there are no aisle seats available. The woman's nostrils flared. Oh, I see. I'm sure if I looked different, you'd find a seat. The words hit like a slap. Once, Clarissa might have agreed, might have even believed it. But today, standing on this side of the counter, feeling the weight of every passenger's expectation pressing against her, she saw the truth. Sometimes, it wasn't about race or class or status. Sometimes, people just assumed they deserved more. No matter what. She met the woman's gaze. Steady but calm. I treat every passenger the same. Ma'am, the woman snorted. Well, that's a shame. I thought you were supposed to help people. Clarissa wanted to say something. Wanted to explain that helping wasn't the same as giving in. But the woman had already turned away, muttering under her breath, shaking her head as if Clarissa had failed some unspoken test. She exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing into the counter. For the first time, she truly understood the exhaustion in Mara's voice when she had told her, "You still don't get it, do you?" She was starting to. She had spent years believing she was in control, that her authority was deserved, that her judgment was right. But standing at this gate, forced to swallow her own pride, she saw what she had refused to before. That power is not the same as respect. That people don't remember the uniform, the policies, the rules. They remember how you made them feel. She had made Edric Holt feel like he didn't belong. And now, she understood exactly what that felt like. Her shift ended late, after the last passenger had boarded and the last complaint had been filed away into the system like another meaningless footnote. As she pulled off her name tag and stepped into the quiet hallway leading to the employee exit, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflective surface of a glass panel. She didn't look different. Same hair, same uniform, but something had changed. She had spent years walking through airports with her head high, certain of her place. Now, for the first time, she felt the weight of every moment she had dismissed, every assumption she had made, every quiet act of superiority she had wielded without a second thought. And yet, the most unsettling part wasn't the shame. It was the question that came with it. Who am I if I can't be the person I thought I was? The terminal buzzed with late-night travelers, their conversations a blur of exhaustion and anticipation. Clarissa stepped into the crowd, feeling, for the first time in a long time, like just another person in transit. Not above, not below, just another person trying to get to wherever she was supposed to go next. The problem was, for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure where that was. The morning air was crisp as Clarissa Vaugh stepped into the towering glass headquarters of Holt Airlines. The city outside was already alive. Traffic humming, people moving with the quiet determination of those who had places to be. Lives to live, but inside these walls, her life was about to be decided. She had spent years walking through airports with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged. No. Someone who knew she belonged. Now, as she approached the executive suite, her steps felt measured, deliberate, the weight of uncertainty pressing down with every stride. She had rehearsed what she would say. She had spent the entire night replaying the moment she would sit across from Eleanor Holt. The woman who had built an empire. The woman who had the power to erase her career with a single sentence. Clarissa had crafted defenses, explanations, a carefully constructed argument about misunderstanding and procedural enforcement. But something inside her knew those words wouldn't hold. Not this time, because the truth, the real truth, was staring her down in a way she could no longer avoid. A sleek, no-nonsense receptionist greeted her with a polite nod. "Mrs. Holt will see you now." Clarissa walked through the heavy oak doors. the scent of leather and fresh coffee hanging in the air. Eleanor Holt sat behind a desk so unadorned it almost felt like a challenge. No clutter, no distractions, just the woman herself. Sharp-eyed and unreadable. She didn't motion for Clarissa to sit. But Clarissa took a chair anyway, placing her hands carefully in her lap. Eleanor studied her for a moment, fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Then she leaned forward, folding her hands together. "Do you know why you're here, Miss Vaugh?" Clarissa swallowed, keeping her voice steady. "I assume it's about my reassignment." A single nod. "And do you understand why you were reassigned?" She had answered so many difficult questions in her life. She had handled disgruntled passengers, entitled executives, tense security situations. But this was different. This wasn't just a question. It was a demand, an expectation. She exhaled. "Because I made a mistake." Eleanor didn't react. She didn't offer relief or confirmation. She let the silence stretch. Waiting. Clarissa's fingers curled against her skirt. "Because I assumed something I shouldn't have. I looked at your husband and decided he didn't belong before I ever checked a manifest. Before I ever looked at his ticket. She hesitated, then forced the words out. "I saw him, and I thought I knew the truth before I had any facts." Eleanor leaned back slightly, nodding once, as if hearing what she already knew. "And what did you learn?" Clarissa's mouth went dry. She had spent her entire life enforcing rules, believing in the order of things. She had lived by structure, by certainty. But now, standing on the other side of it, she saw something else entirely. "I learned that power isn't about control. It's about responsibility." The words felt heavier as she spoke them. "I thought enforcing the rules made me right. But it didn't. It just meant I could justify being wrong." Eleanor finally shifted, sitting back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Most people in your position would have walked into this meeting ready to defend themselves," she said. "They would have told me about how they were following procedure, how they didn't mean any harm. But you didn't." She paused. "Why?" Clarissa breathed in, letting the moment settle. "Because I know better now." Eleanor studied her for another long moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, she slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. A new contract, a new position. Clarissa hesitated before picking it up. She had expected termination. She had expected to be dismissed, discarded, told to find another career. But the document in her hands wasn't a severance agreement. It was an offer. "Ground operations?" she asked, scanning the title at the top. Eleanor nodded. "You spent years controlling who sat where. Now, you're going to learn what it feels like to make sure everyone gets where they need to go." Her voice softened, just slightly. "You said something important just now. That power isn't about control, it's about responsibility. If you believe that, then prove it." Clarissa stared at the paper. The salary was lower. The prestige was gone. It wasn't a punishment. Not exactly. It was something else. A test. A choice. She set the paper down carefully. "Why give me this chance?" Eleanor's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I know better, too." Clarissa didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch this time. Let herself feel the weight of what was happening. Then, slowly, she reached for the pen and signed her name. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and met Eleanor's gaze. "I won't waste it." Eleanor nodded once, briskly. "Good." Clarissa walked out of the office. Past the receptionist. Past the gleaming floors and glass walls. Past the old version of herself that had once believed authority was the same as being right. The airport outside bustled with motion. People hurrying to their gates. Families reuniting. Strangers passing one another without a second glance. She had walked through spaces like this for years, feeling above it all, believing she understood the rules of the world. Now, for the first time, she was stepping into it as a part of it. The world didn't stop for her. It never had. But now, for the first time, she wasn't trying to stop it either. She was just trying to move forward.